Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part B. In sight, in mind, but far away in time. The Untold Stories of Ancient Jerusalem. Chapter 1. What was left untold because it was self-evident to the authors and readers of the biblical descriptions about ancient Jerusalem. The Untold Story begins with the descriptions about ancient Jerusalem. These descriptions were written by writers from Jerusalem who lived in Jerusalem. They were written for those who lived in the city and visited it and knew it well. There was no need to explain much or go into detail when these descriptions mentioned well-known and familiar places, buildings, gates, or sections of the wall, and there was certainly no need to explain or go into detail when mentioning the temple or the king's palace. Important components of the landscape that surrounded Jerusalem were also familiar and well known, and there was no need to elaborate on their location or characteristics. There was no need from the writer's perspective to burden the readers with everything they already knew. It was also impossible to alter the description of or be purposefully inaccurate about all these, since any change, exaggeration, or inaccuracy would be immediately noticeable to the readers, who knew, for example, that the Gihon spring was downhill from the city and that the temple was uphill from it. They knew very well that the Kidron Valley is the eastern border of the city, and they knew where the tombs of the house of David are located. The geography of Jerusalem has not changed, and the landscape around the city remained part of the memory surrounding the city throughout its years of existence. Central buildings and prominent objects within the city also remained in the memory of those who lived in and visited it, and it was not necessary to elaborate much when these prominent elements in the landscape and the city were mentioned in the historic descriptions. These things were self-evident for the contemporaneous generations. The problem lies with readers of later generations, who were already far away from the Jerusalem of the days of the first and second temple, and were no longer privy to the sequence of memories on which the historical descriptions were based. It is no longer clear to us that the king's palace is located above the house of Uriah the Hittite and his wife Bathsheba, and that the temple stands at a higher altitude than the king's palace. We no longer know all the gates of First Temple era Jerusalem, the towers on the wall, the location of the house of heroes or the house of heroes of David, which was a symbol in the landscape of Jerusalem even during the Persian period 150 years and more after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the end of the Judahite independence. We don't even know the location of the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the main road to the fuller's field, as described in 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 17, or the location of the Garden of Uzzah, where, according to the 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 21, verses 18 and 26, the last kings of Judah were buried, that is, those who had the privilege of being buried. Therefore, I want to dedicate the first chapter about the story left untold by the biblical authors to the omissions regarding Jerusalem, since they were clear and self-evident to the authors and readers of these descriptions. Some of these details are also known to us, but others are not. But let's start from the beginning and in an orderly fashion. Jerusalem is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible from the book of Joshua to the book of Chronicles 667 times. As we know, the city is not mentioned in the Pentateuch except for a few hints apparently inserted very late. In the books of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, Jerusalem is mentioned as a foreign city, a Jebusite one, until its conquest by David. We shall expand on it later. The name Yevus appears in these books 41 times. In 25 cases, it is used in reference to the one of the ancient peoples of Canaan. But 16 times, Yevus is mentioned as the ancient name of Jerusalem or as a collective name for those who settled there before it was conquered by David. The name City of David is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible 44 more times, and in total, the city is mentioned in the entire Old Testament under its various names 711 times. To these mentions, one must add the many unique names and titles given to the city, mainly in the prophetic literature and the prose, the Psalms. Among them, the name Zion, stands out, appearing in the Hebrew Bible 154 times. Notably, however, only 4 of these mentions are in the historiographical descriptions, and even there, Zion is usually used only in context that doubtfully preserve ancient memories, likely having been influenced by the prophecy and poetry of later periods. That is, it is a name unique mainly to the prophetic literature and biblical poetry, which accounts for about half of its appearances, 40 mentioned in the book of Isaiah and 36 in the Psalms, whereas it is hardly mentioned in the historiographical literature. We'll talk about it later. In the Deuteronomistic historiography, Jerusalem is mentioned 157 times. Apart from the ideological references to the city, the myth associated with it, and the mentions of its being chosen by God, being the seat of the kings and the location of the temple, the question arises, what do we actually know from the biblical descriptions of Jerusalem? What exists within these descriptions that can teach us about the city itself, especially if we look for the information about the ancient periods in the history, what was actually told in these stories about Jerusalem? An examination of the references to Jerusalem in the biblical historiography reveals that they contain little information about the geography of Jerusalem and the nearby area. The city is above the Gihon spring, so it should not be surprising that the mentions of the Gihon spring always involved a descent. For example, in the first book of Kings, chapter 1, verse 33, it is said, "And the king said to them, Take with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon, my son, to ride on my own mule, and bring him down to Gihon." End of quote. Following this, the Kidron River marks the eastern border of the city, a reality that is clear to anyone who knows Jerusalem and reads the descriptions. For example, in the first book of Kings, chapter 2, verses 36 and 37, I'm quoting, "Then the king sent and summoned Shimei and said to him, Build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go forth from there to any place whatever. For on the day you go forth and cross the brook of Kidron, know for certain that you shall die. Your blood shall be upon your own head." End of quote. The Milo, a term likely borrowed from the Assyrians, refers to the stone base of the palace or the citadel in the upper part of the city of David. It was much clearer to the ancient readers than to us. What the description in Samuel 5 verse 9 meant, according to which, I'm quoting, David dwelt in the stronghold or palace or place of refuge, or we'll talk about it, the Metzudah in Hebrew, and called it the city of David. And David built the city roundabout from the Milo inward. In addition, the ancient residents of Jerusalem also knew exactly what was meant by the description of the place where King Jehoash was murdered, according to the second book of Kings, chapter 12, verse 20. I'm quoting, his servants arose and made a conspiracy and slew Joash in the house of Milo on the way that goes down to Sila. End of quote. In all historical accounts, the construction of the palace, the temple, and the city wall is attributed to kings David and Solomon. Apparently, these buildings were well known in the landscape of Jerusalem to everyone who lived in and visited the city, even during much later periods up until its destruction by the Babylonians. Did they look exactly like this as early as the days of the founding kings? Were they built exactly like that, even in the days of David and Solomon, having neither changed nor developed since? It is possible to accept the descriptions of these buildings as they are, attributing their construction to David. This approach is supported, for example, in the comment written in the second book of Samuel, chapter 20, verse 3, according to which David came to his house at Jerusalem, or in the more detailed description in chapter 5, verse 11, according to which Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons who built David a house. In the first book of Kings, chapter 7, verse 1, on the other hand, the building of the palace is attributed to Solomon. I'm quoting, Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. End of quote. The construction of the palace is attributed to Solomon also in other stories associated with his time, such as, for example, the story of the Pharaoh's daughter being brought to Jerusalem in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 1. I'm quoting. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of Yahweh and the wall around Jerusalem. The same reality is described also in the first book of Kings, chapter 9, verse 15. And this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of Yahweh and his own house and the Milo and the wall of Jerusalem. End of quote. The king's palace was below the temple. Therefore, naturally, the movement from the temple to the palace is described as descent. Jeremiah 36, verse 12, for example. And the movement from the palace to the temple is described always as ascent, like in second book of Kings, chapter 20, verse 8. Thus, for example, after the rebellion against Queen Athaliah, the description in second book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 19 is, I'm quoting, they brought the king down from the house of Yahweh, marching through the gate of the guards to the king's house. And he took his seat on the throne of the kings. End of quote. To the writers and readers of this description, the geographical logic was self-evident, and they also knew the palaces mentioned in it. Furthermore, the palace and the temple were clearly in the higher part of the city, and from the roof of the palace, David could see Bathsheba, Uriah the Hittite's wife, bathing in her own house, according to second book of Samuel, chapter 11, verse 2. The built-in tension in the story is the knowledge that Bathsheba became pregnant for David and David's attempt to get Uriah, her husband, to sleep with her in order to cover it. In light of this, I assume that all the residents of Jerusalem understood the emphasis on the verb yarad, go down, which recurs 4 times in the story, in which Uriah refuses to go home and stays in the king's palace, and we can see it in verses 8 to 10. The instruction of the king to Uriah is, go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah didn't agree. And I'm quoting, but Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with the servants of his lord. And when they told David that Uriah didn't go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why didn't you not go down to your house? End of quote. It is quite clear that the home of Bathsheba and Uriah was below the king's palace. I suppose that the geography of Jerusalem added an important dimension to the understanding of the story from its beginning, when David noticed Bathsheba bathing, through its end when David realized that Uriah would not agree to come down to his house. This, of course, initiates the second part of the story and ultimately leads to the death of Uriah the Hittite on the battlefield in service of David's army. Furthermore, many of the gates and towers in Jerusalem's wall and in the temple were also mentioned in the biblical descriptions, although in most cases without additional details that could aid in their identification or provide clues about their function, which must have certainly been known and clear to the residents of Jerusalem in the First Temple era. Thus, for example, in the second book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 13, relates that Jehoash, king of Israel, captured Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Joash, son of Ahaziah, at Bet Shemesh, and came to Jerusalem and broke down the wall of Jerusalem for 400 cubits, from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate. Such a long section of a wall, apparently in the northern part of Jerusalem, was certainly familiar to the city's residents. For them, this description was clear and understandable. Perhaps at later time they could even identify the repairs that had been made to the breached wall. Moreover, additional gates are mentioned that are also known to us. Thus, for example, with the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, the escape of King Zedekiah and his men is described in the second book of Kings, chapter 25, verse 4, as happening by the way of the gate between the two walls by the king's garden, and from there eastward, apparently through the Kidron valley towards the Arabah. At the same time, as the prophet Jeremiah was trying to leave Jerusalem towards the north, it is said in Jeremiah 37, verse 13, that he was captured at the Benjamin gate. And with the conquest of the city, it is said in Jeremiah 39, verse 3, that all the princes of the king of Babylon came and sat in the middle gate. So we have the gate between the two walls, the Benjamin gate, and the gate which is the middle gate. It is also known from Jeremiah 19, verse 2, that there was another gate in the western part of the city, since this verse describes God's instruction to the prophet, and I'm quoting, "Go out to the valley of the son of Hinnom, Gay Ben Hinnom, at the entry of the potsherd gate, and proclaim there the words that I tell you." End of quote. Additional towers and gates are frequently mentioned in prophecies and stories. Thus, evidently, everyone who lived in and knew Jerusalem was clear about what the prophet Jeremiah meant in his future vision of places, towers, gates, valleys, and streams. We can only recognize a few of these. The description in Jeremiah 31, verses 38 to 40 is a good example of the wealth of familiarity with Jerusalem and the author's ability to use this familiarity to convey a message that he wanted to, the description he wrote, and we don't understand it all the time. Anyone who read the descriptions and knew, like the author, Jerusalem of that time, was able to understand the description and the messages embedded in it. From the distance of the years and without this intimate acquaintance with Jerusalem, large part of the text remained obscure and incomprehensible. I'm quoting, "Behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, when the city shall be rebuilt for Yahweh from the tower of Hananel to the corner gate, and the measuring line shall go out farther, straight to the hill Gareb, and shall then turn to Goah. The whole valley of the dead bodies and the ashes, and all the fields as far as the brook Kidron, to the corner of the house of the horse gate towards the east, shall be sacred to Yahweh. It shall not be uprooted or overthrown any more forever." End of quote. Clearly, the walls and gates of Jerusalem were repaired, renovated, continued to develop, and underwent changes over the years. Some of these changes are attributed to specific kings, such as the note added to the end of the description of the days of King Yotam, the son of Uzziah, in the second book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 35, according to which he built the upper gate of the house of Yahweh. In Isaiah 22, verses 9 to 11, the prophet describes changes that were made to the city and its fortifications, apparently during the days of Ahaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. And in this case too, it is clear that everyone who lived in the city at the time knew and understood exactly what was being discussed. The references are much less clear for those who live far in time and place. And I'm quoting, "And you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many, and you collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. But you didn't look to him who did it, or have regard for him who planned it long ago." End of quote. Similarly, the location of neighborhoods in Jerusalem was also clear at that time the Bible descriptions were written. Thus, for example, contemporaneous readers would understand the location of the house of Huldah the prophetess, who, according to the second book of Kings, chapter 22, verse 14, I'm quoting, "dwelt in Jerusalem in the second quarter, Hamishne," or the garden of Uzzah, first referenced in the days of King Menashe as the site where the kings of the house of David were buried. It is said in the second book of Kings, chapter 21, verse 18 that, I'm quoting, "Menashe slept with his fathers and was buried in the garden of his house, in the garden of Uzzah," end of quote. And there is also the son Ammon, who also was buried there, according to verse 26. Finally, notably, that there are many other places that are described offhandedly, as the writers assume their location to be known and clear, leaving us with no idea what they are referring to. Thus, for example, the arrival of the Assyrian army to Jerusalem, as described in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 17, and the same in Isaiah 36, verse 2. According to the former, I'm quoting, "And they went up and came to Jerusalem. When they arrived, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the road to Fuller's Field." We now know where it is. All this information is fascinating raw material for modern historians and archaeologists who can offer reconstructions of the stories left untold by ancient historiographers, attaining new insights to help complete these short, undetailed descriptions. All of these reconstructions, undertaken today with complex research tools, lead to hypotheses that are uncertain regarding matters that were visible, clear, and known to the generation that lived when the descriptions were written. For now, let's examine one example of many which shows how many different texts can be combined into very complex restored historical picture. Try to follow me in this path. Nehemiah 3, verse 16. In describing the construction of the sections of the Jerusalem wall in the days of Nehemiah, mentions three central and important places that were well known back in the days of the first temple, perhaps even in the very early history of Jerusalem and Judah, and were also famous landmarks during the Persian period and the days of the return to Zion hundreds of years later. I'm quoting. After him, Nehemiah, the son of Azbuk, ruler of half district Beit Tzur, donated for the repairing the wall to a point opposite the tombs of David, to the artificially made pool, and to the house of the mighty men. End of quote. The wall was built along a route that included these three places: the tombs of David, the artificially made pool, and the house of the mighty men, all three of which are good examples of an untold story simply because the things were so clear and well known to those who knew Jerusalem, lived in it or visited it and made a pilgrimage to it, that there was no need to describe them in detail to explain anything about them. Today, scholars dispute the location of the tombs of David on the basis of the hewn tombs that were found under the ancient palace in the city of Samaria, which were proposed to be identified with the tombs of the kings from the Omri dynasty, the kings of Israel, and based on the existence of tombs all over the ancient Near East within royal palace complexes. My teacher Nadav Naaman has suggested that the practice of burying kings in their houses, that is, under their palaces, was common and accepted. In his opinion, the palace also served as the burial place for the kings of the house of David, until the last kings whose graves were moved to the garden of Uzzah. The mention of the artificial built pool near the tombs of the kings from the house of David can be tied to two other places which are mentioned in the previous verse in the list of Nehemiah chapter 3 verse 15. I'm quoting, the wall of the pool of Shelach of the king's garden. End of quote. The pool of Shelach and the king's garden are probably also mentioned in the night tour that Nehemiah made, and according to the description in Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 14, he also passed through, I'm quoting, the fountain gate and the king's pool, apparently on the eastern slope of the city. If this king's garden mentioned here is also the king's garden that is mentioned in the second book of Kings chapter 25 verse 4, as well as in Jeremiah 25 verse 7, as the place through which King Zedekiah and his men fled towards the Arabah, we read it before, and is the garden that was planted downhill from the Kidron, then it can be identified as the garden of Uzzah, which according to the second book of Kings, chapter 21, verse 18, was the garden where King Menashe was buried. I'm quoting again. And Menashe slept with his fathers and was buried in the garden of his house, in the garden of the king, in the garden of Uzzah. The location of the garden outside the walls of Jerusalem explains the various texts which refer to the kings who preceded Hezekiah, who were all buried in the city of David, and to the kings of Judah from Hezekiah onward, in their final Deuteronomistic formulas, the city of David is no longer mentioned. Hezekiah's burial place is unknown, since all that is written about it in his final Deuteronomistic formula in the second book of Kings, chapter 20, verse 21 is, "And Hezekiah slept with his fathers." There is no definite information about Hezekiah's burial place, and it remains unclear whether he was the last to be buried in the tombs of the house of David, which were inside the city, or the first to be buried in the garden of Uzzah outside the city of Jerusalem. This change in the burial place of the Davidic kings should be tied to the words of the prophet Ezekiel, who came from the Jerusalemite priestly family and was deported during Jehoiachin's exile to Babylon. In Ezekiel 43, verses 7 to 9, very harsh things were said of the Judean king's burial places' proximity to the temple. And I'm quoting, "And he said to me, Son of a man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither there nor their kings, by their harlotry, and by the dead bodies of their kings, by setting their threshold by my threshold and their doorposts beside my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them. They have defiled my holy name by their abominations which they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their idolatry and the dead bodies of their kings far from me, and I will dwell in their midst forever." End of quote. Ezekiel's words appear to indicate that priests who served in the temple criticized its proximity to the palace, the residence of the kings of Judah, and also their likely burial place, as only a wall stood between them. This description offers a glimpse into the struggle between the royal house and the priests in the temple. It might also reveal the criticism that the priests had of the king's way of life, as well as the priest's perception that the king's burial in the palace leads to impurity, which affects the temple as well. Even if this criticism had an effect, and from the time of Hezekiah or the time of Menashe, the burial place was moved to a new site outside the walls of Jerusalem, the tombs of the first kings of Judah remained in the palace. Thus, Ezekiel's words echo the priestly criticism about the impurity that the bodies of the kings brought to the temple, which stood adjacent to the palace. I accept the proposal of Nadav Ne'eman, according to which, after all the kings of Judah, from the first king in the 10th century BCE to Ahaz in the 8th century BCE, were buried in the palace, within the city limits and near the temple, it was King Hezekiah who moved the Judean king's burial site to a new location outside the walls of Jerusalem. He did this on account of the warnings and perhaps also the pressure of the temple's priests, who believed that the burial in the palace had made the nearby temple impure. If we accept this conclusion, it can shed new light on Hezekiah's religious policy and the processes of the formation of the Deuteronomistic ideology. After all, according to the Book of Kings, Hezekiah initiated a cultic reform, perhaps moving the royal burial place outside the city might have been a part of this reform. This is only one example of an untold story and our attempts to reconstruct this story from within the silence of those who wrote the description and didn't need to mention that things that were clear and understandable to them. This reconstruction can also relate to the many dozens of hewn tombs found around the city of Jerusalem from the 8th through the 6th centuries BCE, where the elite families of Jerusalem were buried, always outside the city's borders. The impurity of the dead surrounded the living city. In the next chapter, we move to the ancient periods in the history of Jerusalem regarding which the silence of the authors resulted from their own lack of information. We will try to understand what they knew, what they reconstructed from the reality they knew in the Jerusalem of their own time, and projected onto the distant past, and perhaps also complete some information from the knowledge we possess today.